this is the super fast-paced review of D4 from the new IB biology curriculum. All right, we're going to start with D4.1, natural selection. All right, natural selection often shows up as a paper 2 question, and it's very important you always just start with saying that variation arises in a population from random mutation. Be very careful not to say that an individual ever evolves or an individual adapts. Okay, the reason that we see evolution happening through the mechanism of natural selection is because organisms produce more offspring than the environment can support. Among those offspring, there's variation which arose from random mutations, and some of those variants are going to just be better suited to the environment. We say that they have a higher fitness. That means that they have a higher chance of being able to survive to reproductive age and then be able to pass on those genes to their offspring. We call this survival of the fittest. Those individuals that are less fit have a higher risk of mortality from predation or other factors. And so the features that aid survival are disproportionately inherited by successful offspring. Therefore, those traits increase in frequency in the population. The heritable features of the population have changed, so it has evolved. This happens continuously over billions of years. It has resulted in the biodiversity of life on Earth. So make sure you don't say that an individual is adapting, because the individual just has those random mutations which can get passed on that happen to give it a higher fitness, and so then it can have a higher chance of producing offspring with those traits. Okay, we've briefly talked before about just Lamarck versus Darwin. Understand that before Darwin came along, the overwhelming understanding was this individuals passing on traits that they acquired during their lifespan, known as Lamarckism. And so Darwin basically, that theory of natural selection is going to be a paradigm shift, a massive change in what is a generally believed theory. All right, you should know that alleles are different forms of a gene. We know that every individual has the same genes at the same location on the same chromosomes, but they might have different forms of a gene known as alleles that can be as similar as just being one base different, or they could be significantly different. You should also know that gametes refer to egg and sperm, the sex cells that have half the genetic information of the parent. Okay, again, remember that variation comes from random mutation. Okay, and then once we have those variations in the genes, okay, additional variation shows up through the process of meiosis and just sexual reproduction, where we have new combinations of alleles from two individuals. So asexual reproduction does occur. Okay, the only source of variation then is going to be mutation, and it's generally assumed that such species are not going to generate enough variation to evolve quickly enough for survival during times of environmental change. Okay, we then did an investigation on the rock pocket mouse. Remember that this is a clear example of natural selection that we can see happening right in front of us. All right, so this is the carrying capacity of the population. That means the size of a population that can be supported by the environment. There's going to be some type of limiting factor that starts to come into play here at this part of the sigmoidal curve. Okay, and then this is the maximum size we can, the environment can support based on things like food availability, for plants, light availability, but there's going to be a struggle for existence within a population. Okay, selection pressures can either be biotic, referring to living factors like food, mates, predation, competition with other organisms, or abiotic factors, which are non-living, such as space, temperature, altitude, or amount of sunlight available. Now, these abiotic factors, let's see, well, they don't necessarily have to be abiotic here. We can have density-dependent limiting factors, is where as there's a higher population density, the limiting factor becomes stronger. These actually tend to be biotic. Okay, and examples include things like predation, disease, parasites, waste accumulation, right? If you have a population of 20 penguins versus 20,000, these factors are going to have a different amount of effect, right? If you have 20,000, then a disease can, have a larger effect because they're closer together. There's more of them to infect. Okay. In contrast, a density independent limiting factor is going to affect regardless of how many there are. If there's 20 plants versus 20,000, they're all going to die if there is a freeze or a flood or a fire. It's going to take out the entire population, whether the population is high or low. We're going to have more offspring than the environment can support. And so natural selection happens as all of the members of a population are competing against each other, which we call intraspecific. Intra means within. So within the species, they're competing against each other. Okay, fitness influences both whether or not an individual survives for long enough to be able to reproduce, and then of those that do survive, how many offspring that they have. Okay, common misconceptions, again, is that acquired characteristics can be inherited by offspring. Okay, that is not the case. Okay, so a heritable mutation is a change to the base sequence of DNA due to a mistake during DNA replication, and this has to have occurred during the production of eggs or sperm cells in order for it to be passed on to offspring. Okay, half the genes in an animal's offspring come from its mate, and so there's an advantage to accurately assessing whether the potential mate is well adapted to its offspring, because that is then going to have your offspring be more successful. Okay, this is going to be something that courtship behavior allows for individuals to determine whether that individual is strong and whether that's going to be a good potential mate. Okay, this could include things like the ability of a male to overpower other males by fighting, anatomical features that appear to the human eye to be excessive, like the tail feathers of a male peacock, or behavior patterns that seem bizarre, like the plumage and courtship displays of a male bird of paradise. For example, a male bird of paradise can have really showy plumage. Now, by showing that they can survive with this showy plumage shows even though they're more visible to predators and this showy plumage could encumber them, they're showing that they're still strong enough to be able to survive, find enough food, avoid predation, and so that can make them more attractive then to the females that are showing, because they're showing that they're really strong. Okay, the complicated courtship dance can help the female identify that the male is indeed part of their species to avoid that interspecific hybridization that can lead to sterile offspring. Okay, we basically just covered all of that. All right, here is an example. John Endler, he studied guppies in Trinidad and Tobago. Okay, he found that coloration gives an advantage to males, as females prefer color from males, but they can be a disadvantage in shallow water because it makes the males more visible to predatory fish. And so he studied multiple guppies and he looked at counting the spots on the guppies. Okay, so we had puppies in pond Q that didn't have predators. Okay, and he introduced those into two other ponds, pond R and pond S. Pond R just had a weak predator. Okay, pond S had a strong predator. And then he looked at how the number of spots changed, okay, over many months. So here we're going to have pond Q where there's no predators. Okay, we can see here the number of spots is growing because those spots are more attractive to females. Okay, and there's no predators to influence the number of spots in a negative way. Okay, and that pattern is similar to pond R, where there's just a weak predator. Okay, the number of spots is increasing. Pond S, on the other hand, where we had the strong predator, you can see the number of spots decreased. And so that strong predator was able to spot those guppies more easily that have spots. And so those were, you can see the number of spots were decreased over time. Okay, this is just a practice DBQ from the textbook. That takes us to the end of SL content for D 4.1. Okay, if you're HL student, let's keep going. All right, so the gene pool is all of the genes in the population, including all of the different alleles. Remember, again, that a population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same area. Okay, in humans, there can be differences in allele frequencies between ethnic groups and geographical regions, as shown here. Okay, so we are going to talk about natural selection then as a change in allele frequency in a population over time. Now, Darwin didn't understand about DNA or didn't use the term alleles, and so this is a better way now that we understand how genetics works to be able to explain natural selection. Okay, now we have 3 types of selection we're going to differentiate between. Okay, first up is directional selection. So this is where the population changes as one extreme of a range of variation is better adapted. An example of this is the medium ground finch. Okay, if during dry years small seeds aren't abundant, okay, then we're going to see if only large seeds are able to survive a drought, then birds that have larger beaks are going to have an advantage to be able to get into those seeds and eat. And birds then with smaller beaks are not going to be able to access that food source, are going to be less fit, therefore they're not going to be able to survive to pass on those genes for small beaks onto their offspring. And so we're going to see a directional shift in beak size towards larger beaks for being able to get into those seeds. And so that's directional selection is going to be in one direction. Next up, stabilizing selection is where there's selection pressures on 2 sides of this mean. And so we're going to see human birth weight as an example. Okay, if the baby's too small, then it's not going to be developed enough to survive outside the womb. But if the baby's too big, there can be problems with birth itself. And so we see this stabilizing selection where the medium weight babies are going to be the most successful. And then lastly, we have disruptive selection. And this is where there can be selective pressure to remove those intermediate varieties and favor the extremes. Okay, an example of this is coho salmon. Okay, so small coho salmon are going to be able to have an advantage at sneaking to be able to fertilize the eggs that the female has just released. And then the large ones are going to have an advantage because they can fight off the small and medium sized. And so we see a selection against those medium ones. They're not able to fight for the females, and they're not able to sneak in to fertilize the eggs. And so we're seeing less of those males able to pass on their genes for medium size and either small or large salmon being numbers increased. Okay, so here's just a summary then of those 3 types of selection. All right, this is just a review of genetics. You should know all about how each of these example letters here, what they indicate. You can pause if you need to review those things. All right, so the Hardy-Weinberg equation can be used to predict allele frequencies from genotype frequencies. Okay, we're going to have 2 equations. P represents the dominant allele and Q is the recessive. P plus Q will always equal 1. The Hardy-Weinberg equation then is where we have P squared, so that's our homozygous dominant, like big A, big A. Okay, 2PQ is a heterozygous individuals. If you picture a Punnett square, right, there's 2 ways to get heterozygous, big A, or little a, big A, but we can always talk about heterozygous with the big A first, but that's why it's 2PQ. And then Q squared is the individuals who are homozygous recessive, little a, little a. Okay, here's an example problem. Usually for Hardy-Weinberg equations, you're going to be given your Q squared value, which is the frequency of the recessive phenotype in the population. So in this case, we're looking at albinism, which is 1 in 20,000 people. Okay, and so that's our Q squared. Now, if you're given the phenotype of that's dominant, that's going to be not really very helpful because you don't know which of those are going to be the P squared versus the 2PQ, because we know that whether an individual is homozygous dominant or heterozygous, the phenotype will be the same. And so you're usually going to be given your Q squared, which is your homozygous recessive. Okay, so if you're given Q squared, you can just square root that value to get your Q. And then once you have Q, you can subtract that from 1 to get your P. Once you have your P and your Q values, okay, then you can say any of the following things. You might be asked for the probability of the heterozygous phenotype, like this problem where you would just take 2PQ, or you could be asked for the P squared, or, well, if you weren't given Q squared, you could be asked for that. So once you have P and Q, you can answer any questions. Okay, here's just another example. We're given the Q squared. So again, you would square root it, solve for P, and then once you have Q and P, you can indicate any of those values that you're asked for. Now, the Hardy-Weinberg frequencies are only expected if the following series of conditions are met, and you should memorize these. Number 1, there's no mutation happening. 2, mating is random. 3, there's no immigration or emigration. 4, the population is very large. And 5, there is no natural selection. So, if the genotypic frequencies in a population fit the predictions from Hardy-Weinberg, we will conclude that all the conditions are being met. And therefore, if they don't fit Hardy-Weinberg, that indicates that one or more of these conditions is not being met. If we can ensure that these first 4 are being met, then we can demonstrate that there is natural selection occurring in a population. Okay, artificial selection, remember, is where humans specifically are choosing individuals to breed that have desirable traits. It can be plants, it can be animals, and we have been doing this for thousands of years. We are selecting and breeding the individuals with traits that are most suited to human uses, but that variation came from, again, remember, random mutation. Okay, so here you can see some examples. We've talked about this before. Okay, note you might be asked if the evolution of resistance in bacteria is an example of artificial selection, but that is not, because it is not humans specifically choosing the bacteria out. So remember, artificial selection has to be human choice. All right, it's time to move on to D 4.2. So SL students will need to come back to the review. All right, stability is the absence of change. Community stability is due to the absence of disturbance or community resistance to disturbance. So let's differentiate between these terms. Resistance is the ability of a community or ecosystem to remain unchanged despite a disturbance, whereas resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to rebound from change. Okay, so some examples of ecosystems that have persisted for a long period of time. The Daintree rainforest in northern Australia, has existed for 180 million years. The Borneo lowland rainforest, 140 million years. And the Namib Desert in southern Africa, estimated to be 55 to 80 million years old. These are all stable, high stability ecosystems. So let's look at how we could represent this on a graph. Note, high resistance and high resilience. Okay, that's going to be here. High resistance means if there's a disturbance indicated by this dashed line, okay, that there's only going to be a small change because it's highly resistant to change. Okay, but then it's also going to be able to bounce back, which means it has a high resilience. Number 2, high resistance and low resilience. Okay, high resistance means after disturbance, it's only, again, going to have a small change, but it has low resilience, and so it's not able to bounce back. Low resistance and high resilience, you can see here. Low resistance means after disturbance, we're going to see a large change, but because of the high resilience, it's going to be able to bounce back. Okay, and then lastly here, we have low resistance and low resilience. Okay, so stability depends on the following key conditions: a steady supply of energy, recycling of nutrients, genetic diversity, and climatic variables such as temperature and precipitation remaining within tolerance levels. Just as a reminder, energy is going to flow into an ecosystem, whereas nutrients cycle through an ecosystem. Okay, disruptions that interfere with stability could include harvesting by humans, erosion, eutrophication, which we're going to talk about in a second here, selective removal of species by epidemics or poaching, and climate change. Okay, a tipping point is the point at which an ecosystem can no longer cope with environmental change, and it's going to suddenly shift from one state to another in a way that is difficult to reverse. You should be familiar with this example of the Amazon rainforest. Okay, we are doing massive deforestation, cutting down huge areas of the rainforest. Okay, but this is a problem because this rainforest, okay, when transpiration occurs, which is evaporation of water from the leaves of plants, okay, we're going to have this whole weather system that we're going to have atmospheric water vapor. Okay, this is going to cause cooling. Okay, it's going to cause rain to fall. But if we cut back a ton of this forest, then we're not having transpiration occurring anymore. We're not going to have the same clouds forming. Okay, and we're going to see a complete shift. Okay, at some point, we're going to hit the tipping point. Okay, where the rainforest no longer is creating these weather patterns. And if we don't have a rainfall in a rainforest, right, we're going to see potentially a complete biome shift occur. Okay, just note you should be able to calculate percent change. These show up on DBQs all the time. Just note with percent change, you need to take the final amount minus the initial amount divided by initial, hit equals or whatever total, and then multiply that by 100. Make sure you don't mess with your order of operations by timesing by 100 too early. Mesocosms can be set up in open tanks, but sealed glass vessels are preferable. Entry and exit of matter can be prevented, but energy transfer is still possible. So energy in the form of sunlight can still enter, okay, but nutrients can cycle within this sealed mesocosm. Okay, a keystone species, memorize this, a species that has a disproportionate effect on the structure of an ecological community. I've seen that on a paper too, as just a 1-mark question right there. Make sure you memorize that word, disproportionate. Species diversity decreases if the keystone species is lost, and it puts the ecosystem at risk of collapse. So this is an example, okay, which is the sea star, Pisaster ocraceus, forgive my Latin. Okay, and so here you can see this food web. This is our keystone species here. You can see that they consume these ties, okay, as well as all of these other barnacles and limpets, etc. Okay, so here is the experiment. We have 2 tide pools. Okay, one was left unaltered as a control. It had high biodiversity. In the second tide pool, okay, all of the sea stars were removed. And here were the results. Okay, in the control, the community biodiversity didn't change. In the experimental, okay, we saw that a barnacle initially took over and occupied 70% of the area. Then the barnacles crowded out by a different species of barnacle and a mollusk. Okay, eventually the mollusk became overwhelmingly dominant. Seaweeds disappeared, apart from one species that can grow on mollusk shells. Other animals were crowded out and lost their food source, so they either died or migrated. So we can see that when this keystone species was removed, okay, the biodiversity of the ecosystem collapsed and we were left with just one single species 5 years later. Okay, so that's demonstrating how a keystone species had that disproportionate effect on that ecosystem. Okay, sustainability depends on the rate of harvesting being lower than the rate of replacement. Okay, we don't want to catch more fish than the fish can reproduce themselves. Okay, so we need to make sure human use of fossil fuels is unsustainable. Fossil fuels are finite. Their use cannot carry on indefinitely. So we need to have enough nutrients. Waste products need to be able to be detoxified, and there has to be enough energy for a sustainable ecosystem to exist. Okay, Brazil nuts, for example, grow on trees in the Amazon rainforest. And if we take every single Brazil nut off of the tree, then the tree is not able to reproduce and grow new trees. And so we need to make sure that we have sustainable harvesting where we leave some of the nuts so the tree is able to reproduce. Okay, The cod fishery in the North Atlantic is an example of ecosystem collapse. Okay, cod was fished like it was a resource that was unlimited. Okay, and there was so much overfishing that occurred that it led to a complete crash in 1992 of the cod. And so since then, we have had to establish some rules about how many cod can be caught to try to establish that as a successful fishery. So the maximum rate of harvest corresponds to this M right here. You can see this is where we have the steepest part of this sigmoidal curve. So this is how much harvesting we can do that's going to allow for that population to continue to grow at its fastest rate without overfishing. Okay, so what are some measures internationally agreed upon to reverse the trend of overfishing of cod? Okay, so these are some things you might be asked to produce. Well, you could set up exclusion zones in nursery areas to allow undisturbed breeding. You could increase the size of holes in nets that allow smaller cod to escape. You could reduce the size of the fishing fleet by decommissioning some boats. Okay, and we can monitor the numbers and ages of cod in the population, then set quotas based on that information. Okay, and this is a success story. Since 2005, the biomass of adult cod in the North Sea has tripled. Okay, currently cod fishing is now sustainable due to some of those practices. Next up, let's look at factors affecting the sustainability of agriculture. Okay, it's going to be important that we look at soil erosion, leaching of nutrients, supply of fertilizers, specifically phosphate is a limited resource. It's mined from rock deposits, but there's only so many. Okay, pollution due to agrochemicals. Okay, and then looking at our carbon footprint from what is being released through our equipment used in agriculture. Okay, note that fertilizers are going to be made up of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And when you see those three numbers on a fertilizer, okay, that's referring to the amount of each of those three nutrients. Now, what happens, okay, is we can have runoff of those nutrients into waterways surrounding agricultural fields. So, biochemical oxygen demand is the amount of dissolved oxygen needed by aerobic organisms, okay, or bacteria, anything that's doing respiration. Eutrophication is the nutrient enrichment of water that leads to an increased biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD. So what we're going to see, okay, is rain falling on agricultural land, water-soluble nutrients such as phosphates and nitrates that have been added to crops, okay, are going to run off and they're going to drain into bodies of water nearby, rivers, streams, lakes. These nutrients allow for rapid growth of algae in those water bodies, leading to algal blooms, which you can see an image of here. So what happens then is unicellular algae and photosynthetic bacteria increase in number and float to the surface, which blocks the light to the plants below. The algal bloom, along with the shaded plants below, die and are decomposed by saprotrophic bacteria. Now, these bacteria are aerobic, and so they consume that oxygen from the water. This consumption then leads to an increased biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD. The higher the BOD, the less oxygen in the water. When we have a high BOD, the water becomes anoxic, has no dissolved oxygen, causing fish deaths. You should be able to walk through that. A lot of times, folks miss step 3. So they understand that algal blooms occur from all of these extra nutrients running off, okay? But they have a hard time connecting that then with fish deaths. You need to make sure that you don't forget to explain that it's the bacteria consuming all of the dead and dying algae and plants that no longer can receive light that are taking all of that oxygen out of the water through respiration as they are decomposing these dead things. Okay, and so make sure you can explain this process. It often shows up on the paper 2 questions. Okay, let's differentiate between bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Bioaccumulation, okay, is when a toxin accumulates in one individual's body tissues throughout its life. So you can see this is happening over time. Okay, this is a particular problem with toxins that are fat soluble, such as mercury, and therefore not easily excreted. So if this red represents mercury, it's building up in this fish over time. On the other hand, biomagnification is where we have those toxins building up through trophic levels in a food chain. And so, say this fish here eats 100 of these organisms over its lifetime. Okay, those toxins then accumulate as we go up the food chain. Okay, and then these are going to eat 100 of these over its lifetime. And so all of these toxins are building up, and we're seeing high levels, okay, especially at organisms that are higher up in the food chain, higher trophic levels. An example of biomagnification is the chemical DDT that bioaccumulated in peregrine falcons in the 50s and 60s, okay, which caused eggshell thinning and led to a drastic decline in the falcon population during these decades. Okay, so DDT was originally sprayed. We didn't realize how bad it was for the kids that used to like run behind the DDT trucks. There are a lot of issues, and this is where Rachel Carson came in. She wrote Silent Spring. Really, we did not understand that there were limited resources and we need to protect our environment. And she really caused a paradigm shift talking about the pesticide industry because she wasn't hearing the birds singing anymore because of the DDT leading to eggshell thinning and the birds dying. And so you should just be familiar with her because she really is someone that you can look up to and respect as a role model for bringing awareness to the issues of basically what we're doing to our environment, and really was key in starting the sort of environmental awareness that we now have. All right, plastics are persistent in the natural environment due to the fact that they're non-biodegradable or degrade slowly. Okay, degradation of plastic waste at sea releases toxic carbon compounds into the ocean that can then bioaccumulate and biomagnify. Okay, macroplastic is large visible debris that can be nets, ropes, etc. Can cause seabirds, turtles to become entangled. This can be ingested, especially this colorful, nets and caps and things are attractive as potential food, but of course we know that they are not. Microplastic fragments then are the result of those physical and chemical degradations of the macroplastics. They're less visible, but far more numerous, and they're currently being investigated what kind of effects there are, and I'm sure we will be hearing a lot more about microplastics going forward. Okay, this is just the example of the lace and albatrosses on Midway, where the chicks are being fed these plastics that are being dumped in the oceans, and they can't throw them back up or digest them, and so it causes death of the chicks, and it's just super sad. It's just a issue that needs to be addressed. Okay, restoration of natural processes and ecosystems by rewilding. Okay, we're seeing a lot of degradation of natural ecosystems by human actions, leading to loss of biodiversity, rapid rates of species extinction, and loss of ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration and climate regulation. Okay, carbon sequestration is, remember, carbon being taken from the atmosphere where it acts as a greenhouse gas into a stored form. So rewilding, okay, the essential principle is there should be as little intervention by humans as possible because natural processes restore habitats more effectively than humans. The first step is to stop human activities. Okay, this may be all that's required. However, more commonly, there's a need for specific interventions to undo past human actions. Okay, examples can include distributing seeds of plants, reintroduction of apex predators, reestablishment of connectivity of habitats where natural ecosystems have become fragmented, control of invasive alien species, and minimization of human impact by ecological management. Okay, an example of where this has been really successful is the Hinoi Reserve in New Zealand, where they've just left it alone and it has amazingly regenerated. Okay, this is an example that shows up all the time of the wolves of Yellowstone. So let's focus right here on this particular food chain. So wolves eat elk. Okay, elk eat many species of trees. 1926, the last wolf was killed in Yellowstone National Park. This keystone species was removed. If the wolf population is removed, then we're going to see the elk population skyrocket. The elk population just went out of control, and so then therefore the trees that the elk eat went way down. Now, not only did they go down, but the trees, especially like along riverbanks where elk would have been really careful not to eat those because they're more exposed to wolf attacks. Okay, the elk went crazy. This actually ended up changing the direction of the rivers. And so, okay, we saw that wolves were finally reintroduced into Yellowstone. Okay, and all of a sudden the ecosystem shifted back into balance. Once this keystone species was present again, okay, it brought the elk numbers under control and allowed then for these trees to come back, okay, and even we're seeing the rivers being reestablished in their changing of their directions. All right, this is the end of SL content for D4.2. Continuing on with the HL content. Okay, ecological succession is a sequence of changes that progressively transform both biotic and abiotic factors in ecosystems. Okay, a climax community is this stable and persistent ecosystem that doesn't undergo further significant change. Okay, these changes can be triggered by biotic triggers like beavers that colonize a river, causes flooding, can change open water into a swamp. Okay, or they could be abiotic. For example, an avalanche in the mountains can sweep away forest and underlying soil, okay, creating a bare substratum on which new succession can begin. All right, there are two types of succession. Primary succession is when there is no soil present. An example of this is a volcanic eruption where there could either just be new rock that's formed or ash that's covering the entire ecosystem. Okay, versus secondary succession where there is soil present. An example of this is like a wildfire where everything dies but the soil is still there. So let's look at the changes that occurred during primary succession. Okay, living organisms are largely or completely absent. Again, there's no soil. Okay, we're going to start with bacteria, lichens, and mosses. Okay, they're going to start breaking down that rock and creating that small amount of soil, which is going to allow herbs with roots to start to colonize. And as more soil develops, we're going to have larger plants that can show up. Okay, and then eventually trees. And here we reach our climax community with our shade-tolerant trees. Animal populations change with the plant populations, as do populations of decomposers. Okay, general principles of primary succession. Species diversity increases as more species join the community, then are eliminated. Primary production increases as larger plants can colonize. There's going to be more photosynthesis. Food webs become more complex, and nutrient cycling can increase as animals and plants generate more dead organic matter. Okay, now we can also have cyclical succession in ecosystems. So instead of a single unchanging climax community, okay, we can see that we cycle through where species replace each other over time repeatedly. For example, oak forests in Northwest Europe, okay, they can cycle between forests and grasslands, okay, and back and forth between grass, oak forest, grass, oak forest. Okay, let's see. Eventually, though, we usually see these climax communities form that are stable. Right now, sometimes we can see that those climax communities are actually have arrested succession, where we stop normal succession due to human actions. And so here you can see due to grazing, this area that might have become a forest or had at least shrubs isn't going to, because of humans putting, animals there that keep it as a grassland. And then a second example of that, drainage of wetlands. So here we have big peat bogs that can form due to these anoxic conditions where everything is waterlogged. And so if humans were to build drains, that would change the entire field. And they might do that in order to be able to use the field for agricultural land, but it does mean that it would change this climax community. All right, let's move to D4.3, our final slideshow. SL students should join us again here. All right, so just to review, okay, here's our visible light. We know that that blue-violet end is going to be those shorter, higher energy wavelengths. So as we go beyond visible light, we get to UV light. So just remember that UV light we know can cause skin cancer because it's higher energy, okay, and it's that shorter wavelength. And therefore the red end is that longer wavelength, lower energy end of the spectrum. So, okay, let's take a look at how a greenhouse works. High energy, short wave solar radiation is going to be able to penetrate this glass. Notice that the long wave isn't going to because it's not high enough energy. Okay, and once that short wave light is able to enter the greenhouse, it then gets reflected as long wave radiation. Okay, and that long wave radiation is then trapped because, again, remember, long wave radiation isn't going to go through the glass, and that's what causes the warming effects in a greenhouse. Now, our planet, okay, is exactly the same, and this we call the greenhouse effect because when shortwave radiation, okay, enters our planet and is reflected off the surface, it can be reflected as long wave, lower energy radiation. Okay, some of which can exit, but some of which gets trapped by those greenhouse gases. Okay, they act just like the glass of a greenhouse, or just think of it as a blanket for the earth. Okay, where it's basically causing this warming effect of re-radiating this long wave radiation in this warming pattern. And that's just called the greenhouse effect. And you need to remember that short wave high energy rays are coming in, reflected as long wave low energy, which then get trapped by the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Okay, now this isn't all bad. If we didn't have any greenhouse gases, the planet would be too cold to support life. And so, but we want just the right amount of greenhouse gases, like the Goldilocks zone of greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide and methane. And of course, humans are releasing a lot of carbon dioxide and methane through the combustion of fossil fuels, etc. And this is leading then to climate change. And we say that it's anthropogenic because anthropo refers to humans, okay? And its origin is human origin causes of climate change. Okay, so CO2 is released into the atmosphere by cell respiration in living organisms, but also combustion of biomass, okay, and fossil fuels. It can be removed from the atmosphere by photosynthesis and by dissolving in the oceans. Okay, methane is emitted from marshes and other waterlogged habitats, as well as landfill sites. Okay, it is released during extraction of fossil fuels and from melting permafrost in polar regions. Okay, note these are the only two greenhouse gases that you need to be familiar with. Okay, the two most abundant gases in Earth's atmosphere are nitrogen and oxygen. They're not greenhouse gases because they don't absorb that long wave radiation. All the greenhouse gases make up less than 1% of the atmosphere. Okay, increased heat due to climate change has an impact on temperature, humidity, precipitation, visibility, wind, and atmospheric pressure, and will have an influence on long-term weather patterns or climate. Excuse me. All right, positive feedback cycles is when the end product of a process results in amplification of the process that created it. Okay, a funny example of this is the number of cattle running and the overall level of panic. The more cattle running, the more panic there is, which is going to cause more cattle to run, which leads to more panic, and this positive feedback loop continues. Okay, global heating is associated with several positive feedback cycles. First up, release of carbon dioxide from the deep ocean. You should know that the solubility of gas in water decreases with temperature. And so, as we have more CO2 in the atmosphere, that's going to cause the global temperature to rise. That causes then the temperature of the ocean to rise, which then releases more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in a positive feedback cycle. Secondly, increases of absorption of solar radiation due to the loss of reflective snow and ice. Okay, so as we have these white ice areas of our planet, okay, as it melts, we have less of that light white colored reflective surface. Okay, water is darker, absorbs more radiation than white ice, and that then just is a positive feedback loop, leads to more ice melting. Okay, accelerating rates of decomposition of peat and previously undecomposed organic matter in permafrost, okay, which is the frozen layer of soil found in places like Siberia. Okay, this is going to lead to release of methane from that melting permafrost. Okay, and so then as we have heating, we're just going to have more melting permafrost in a positive feedback cycle. Okay, and then increases in droughts and forest fires. Okay, if we have more forest fires, that's going to lead to drier, more fire-prone conditions. It's then going to lead to more fires, okay, which produce CO2 as combustion occurs during the fire, and then we then have amplification of the cycle in a positive feedback loop. Okay, when the sum of environmental changes and positive feedback cycles overwhelm the resilience of an ecosystem, a tipping point is reached whereby the ecosystem is converted from one stable form to another. Okay, an example of this is boreal forests, which are mostly composed of pines, spruces, and larches. They're full of life that is adapted to withstand frigid temperatures year-round. So let's look at our example here. Okay, it's normally cold year-round. Okay, this is an overall reducing effect on the rate of cellular respiration. So decomposition of the detritus by detritivores is usually slower. This results in net carbon accumulation out of the atmosphere into the forest as it's sequestered. Current situation though, we're seeing warmer and drier summers. We've seen a string of droughts. This leads to an increase in the frequency and intensity of forest fires, which those forest fires then release carbon dioxide that was stored in centuries of detritus, all those pine needles, okay, on the floor of the forest, okay, are being burned. All that carbon then is released into the atmosphere, and we're seeing a net carbon loss as it's released into the atmosphere. Okay, so we're seeing those widespread fires as a tipping point that can lead the boreal forest to transition from being a carbon sink, where carbon from the atmosphere is stored, to being a carbon source where it's released back into the atmosphere through fires. Okay, land-fast ice is ice that forms off the coasts of land, and so it's basically attached to the land. It's fastened to it, land-fast. Okay, and it's important for emperor penguins that hunt from that land-fast edge of the ice into the open ocean. They depend on that ice for breeding success. Okay, and we saw that in 2018, an early land-fast ice breakup off Ross Island resulted in high mortality of penguin chicks. Okay, sea ice then is also going to be important for walrus habitat. Females often use sea ice to give birth and avoid the risk of their pups being trampled by the larger males. Okay, it also expands access to a broader range of feeding sites, and so as we are seeing polar habitat change, we're seeing a resulting loss of sea ice habitat. Okay, changes in ocean currents altering the timing and extent of nutrient upwelling. Okay, so the ocean is stratified. We have warmer, less salty water. It's less dense, so it floats on top of the colder, saltier, denser water. Mixing between the layers occurs as heat slowly seeps deeper into the ocean, okay, through currents, winds, and tides. However, the greater the difference in density between the layers, the slower and more difficult the mixing. So the bigger the difference, the less mixing occurs. Okay, and so since we're seeing a warming climate, we're seeing warming of this upper layer. Okay, and as that occurs, we're seeing the volume expand. Okay, melting ice adds fresh water to the ocean, further decreasing its salinity. Okay, so we're seeing a bigger difference now in ocean stratification. Okay, warmer, okay, less salty. Okay, and this, remember, is the cold, more salty area. Okay, so the most active biological zone of the ocean is at its surface, where sunlight can penetrate. Carbon fixed by photosynthesis enters the food chain, which eventually sinks into the ocean as detritus and feces. Deep ocean currents that move towards continental shelves, okay, are forced upward, leading to upwelling of nutrients as it reaches the continental shelf, which contributes to the nutrient cycling of the productive surface biological communities. So it's pushing all of that fallen detritus, okay, up to this upper cycle here. Okay, warmer surface water, however, can prevent nutrient upwelling to the surface. This decreases ocean primary production and energy flow through marine food chains. So if that detritus isn't able to push up because of this increased stratification, then those nutrients aren't available to those surface area organisms. Upslope range shifts. Okay, escalator to extinction. So say we have birds that are adapted to this location on a mountain. Okay, if it's warming, okay, they can move up higher where it's cooler, okay, and they're still able to survive. Okay, but then as it continues to warm, they can move further up. Okay, and if it continues to warm, they can move further up, but then they reach the top. This is the problem. As warming occurs, eventually they are not able to move higher in elevation, okay, to the temperatures they're adapted to live in, and so that leads to extinction of that species. We're also seeing this occur as poleward range shifts, and so as warming occurs, species are moving closer to the poles to stay at the temperature they are adapted to. And we've seen evidence for this in butterflies, birds, many North American tree species. Okay, but then eventually, right, we're going to reach the poles, and if warming continues to occur, they're going to run out of colder places or places that are at that temperature to move to. Okay, threats to coral reefs as an example of potential ecosystem collapse. Okay, so we see that as CO2 dissolved in water, that water becomes more acidic, and we're seeing, okay, a constant ocean acidification occurring as more CO2 is released into the environment. Okay, so here you can see atmospheric CO2 increasing and the correlation then with ocean pH decreasing, which means it's becoming more acidic. Now, the problem there is that marine animals, such as reef-building corals that deposit calcium carbonate in their skeletons, they need to be able to absorb carbonate ions from seawater. Okay, but when dissolved carbon dioxide decreases carbonate levels, that's going to make it more difficult for reef-building corals to absorb those carbonate ions to make skeletons. Okay, also the existing skeletons of reef-building corals are going to be threatened. Okay, and we can see that occurring here. Coral bleaching can occur. Okay, coral is an animal that lives in a mutualistic relationship with zooxanthellae algae. Okay, they need each other, okay, in this mutualistic relationship. What we're seeing here is due to ocean temperatures warming, the coral ejects the zooxanthellae. Okay, they take on this bleached appearance. Okay, and then they die because they don't have that mutualistic relationship anymore. So again, this is based on warming temperatures, not the acidification. Carbon sequestration. This is where we are taking carbon dioxide from the air and storing it in some type of sink, okay, including plant matter. Okay, so one option is afforestation. This is the prefix af means toward, so it's different than the prefix a. Okay, so this is where we would plant trees in areas where there were no trees before. Okay, but there's concerns over planting trees in areas where rainfall isn't going to support the survival of those trees. Okay, alternatively, we can look at forest regeneration or reforestation, which is then restocking forests that were previously there that have been depleted. Okay, tree planters can enter the area planting seedlings, but this could be a concern if they are just one type of plant as opposed to having diversity of different plants, because if there's then a disease that affects that plant, then that whole ecosystem disappears because there's not genetic diversity. Okay, peat is again formed in areas where we have waterlogged soils, anoxic environments, and it's these wetlands are the world's largest carbon sink. Okay, so if we're trying to restore these peatlands, that requires the restoration of those water levels, okay, blocking any drains that were put in place and reestablishing native species. Okay, this then is the end of SO content for this video. There's still just a bit more though for HL students. Okay, phenology is research into the timing of biological events. Okay, note that a photoperiod is a length of time an organism is exposed to light during a 24-hour period, also called day length. We know it varies by seasons. Okay, but photoperiod isn't going to change. The planet's still spinning at the same speed. So we're going to see that photoperiod doesn't change, but temperature patterns are changing due to human-caused climate change. And so we're going to look at how these two can sometimes now misalign. Okay, and phenologists are studying this. Okay, note that things like flowering can depend on photoperiod, and so flowering can occur based on the number of hours of sunlight that a plant receives. Okay, bud set in deciduous trees is where buds are forming. Okay, and sometimes it can respond to decreasing temperature, but usually it's determined by a reduction in day length, photoperiod. Okay, bud burst in deciduous trees. Okay, are new leaves at the start of each growing season, sometimes affected by day length, but instead usually determined by temperature. Okay, bird migration and nesting. Birds can migrate then from areas of low to resources to high resources. The primary cue for migration is a change in day length. So we're going to see here that disruption to the synchrony of phenological events can happen due to climate change. So it's temperature, if it acts as a cue in one population, like we saw earlier, okay, photoperiod might be the cue in another, so those might misalign. Many bird species have evolved in such a way that their nesting cycle is synchronized to the period of maximum food availability. Migration is most often triggered by changes in day length, which is not affected by climate change, right? The planet is still spinning at the same speed. But availability of food sources can be based on temperature. And so migratory birds could arrive after quantities of food sources have peaked and then they have nothing to eat. Okay, two specific examples of these disruption. Caribou forage on a range of Arctic plants. Okay, such as the Arctic mouse-ear chickweed. Caribou time their migration to coincide with the emergence of these food plants, which are essential for nursing calves. Evidence is suggesting that climate change has led to a mismatch between the spring growth of the Arctic mouse-ear chickweed and the arrival of those migrating reindeer. Okay, a second example of that are birds like great tits that live in northern European forests. They rely on caterpillars to feed their young, and peak caterpillar mass has been occurring earlier due to warmer weather in the spring. But the reproductive timing of the birds hasn't changed in alignment, and we're seeing fewer and smaller chicks. Okay, the spruce bark beetle is a North American bark beetle, usually develops in weakened trees. Okay, we're seeing that healthy spruce trees can usually resist moderate numbers of beetle attacks, but due to climate events such as drought, okay, entire populations of trees are stressed, and so we're seeing greater numbers of the spruce bark beetle. Okay, usually they require 2 years to complete their life cycle. When temperatures are warmer, they can have generations completed in a single year. Okay, and when that happens, the development is synchronized. The beetles emerge in large numbers to attack trees. Okay, so warm temperatures are that double threat. Okay, they're causing those spruce trees to be susceptible to beetle attack, and the beetles can attack in synchronized greater numbers. Okay, the tawny owl ranges in color from pale gray to brown. Plumage is a heritable trait. Okay, increasingly mild winters over the last 30 years in Finland have reduced the average snow color. Okay, and we're going to see here on the next slide the correlation between snow depth as well as the frequency of the brown variant. Okay, so we can see the frequency of the brown variant increasing as the snow depth decreases. And that takes us to the end of that practice question and then to the end of this video. Thanks for listening.